Welcome to Junck Colloquium. Second to last of the semester, we have Dulcie, our very own Dulcie Strahan, on December 5th, which I'll give you guys all a heads up with. So our last outside visitor for this semester. So I'm pleased to introduce Christina Dunbar-Hester, who is an assistant professor of journalism and media studies at Rutgers School of Communication and Information. Christina received her PhD in science and technology studies at Cornell. And it actually turns out we have a very funny sort of story of how we first met each other, which was in the acknowledgments of a paper by her advisor, Ron Klein, who's a famous historian of science. I was just talking to Christina. She got the more fun assignment. She was going through Margaret Mead's papers at the time. I was at the NASA archives in San Bruno, sorting through something like 500 cubic feet of records, looking for one specific document, which I found, but after 2 months or so of work. So you had the better assignment. Anyway, since those humble beginnings, Christina and I have become really good friends, and I am thrilled to host her here for her first book talk for the released as of last Friday MIT Press book, Low-Power the People, which I'll pass around. It is beautiful. I just got my copy last night, and from what I've read so far, it is fantastic. Christina is also the author of about a dozen journal articles, as well as book chapters that have explored some of the themes in the book more generally, but also the history of technology. So with that, Christina.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I'll get started in a minute, but before that, I would say thank you so much to Daniel for inviting me, and to the School of Journalism and Mass Comm for hosting, and to all of you for coming out on this brisk Friday afternoon. So yeah, without further ado, get into the story, which is an ethnographic study of radio activism, and this is, as Daniel said, this is really bringing together a couple of chapters of the book, so I'd be happy to talk about anything else in Q&A. So I'm thinking about radio activism as a site where people have made reflexive choices to engage with communication technology because they think it's the best way to foster democratic social relations. And the story I'm going to tell turns on the consequences of turning this geekiness, this geeky engagement with technology, into an activist strategy. These radio activists see their technical work as directly linked to the promotion of social justice. But what I show is that as they pursue their political beliefs through work with technology, various contradictions emerge, which require management and creative work. They end up in a balancing act, navigating apparent ironies. For example, this is a geek group trying to be inclusive, and in fact, challenging some hegemonic geekiness. This is also a bunch of weird beard radicals going into Washington, D.C., wearing suits, and walking a line between radical left politics in their organization and mainstream reform work in their advocacy. And perhaps most strikingly, this is a digitally savvy group choosing to work with FM radio, even though they're highly informed about the internet and digital tech. In the interest of time, I will skip a lengthy historical preamble, but I want to note that this phenomenon issues from a particular nexus of distinct yet interwoven social, cultural, technical, and political strands. And these include DIY, or do-it-yourself culture, the appropriate technology movement, a regulatory environment favoring corporate consolidation, accompanied by pushback movement for media reform, indie media and the anti-globalization movement, embedded practices of electronics tinkering with computers and radios, and a long history of community media production and pirate radio. Lastly, of course, this takes place alongside the widespread emergence of digital media and the internet. But this is a technological story, but not a teleological one. This radio activism overlaps with and exists alongside activism around digital media. The group I studied initially formed as a pirate broadcasting collective in Philadelphia in the mid-1990s. But they were raided and shut down by the FCC in 1998. And this is a piratical artifact. This is a little transmitter mounted inside of a lunchbox. And one reason I showed this slide is to emphasize the portability and ubiquity potentially of this technology. I also want to point out in the upper right, we've got this Jolly Roger, pirate iconography. The 1990s saw a proliferation of this unlicensed broadcasting as electronic civil disobedience in protest of government policy that made it impossible for community groups seeking to broadcast at this sort of small level after 1978. So from 1978 through the late 90s, there were no options for them legally. Also during this period, of course, many people became concerned about increasing media consolidation and regulatory environment favoring big corporate media. The case of radio was really dramatic. Within 5 years of the Telecom Act of '96, a single company, Clear Channel Communication, had acquired 1,200 FM radio stations, so that was a 3,000% increase in only 5 years. So after the pirates were shut down, they stopped broadcasting and turned instead to advocacy and assistance to community groups, forming a small nonprofit called Prometheus Radio Project in 1998. So here I'll note I'm referring to the main site by their real name, and everyone else, including individual actors, are pseudonyms. With allies, including organized labor, church groups, and civil rights groups, Prometheus pushed for the implementation of Low-Power FM, which happened in 2000. These LPFM stations are non-commercial, and they operate at 100 watts or less, so that means their scale is very tiny. They don't reach more than a few miles. By 2010, about 850 new LPFMs were on the air nationwide. This may sound like a decent number, but it's actually only about a third as many as advocates had hoped could be built when LPFM was introduced. National Public Radio and the Broadcast Commercial Lobby actually intervened to limit the amount of spectrum available for the low-power stations. So in 2000 then, Prometheus began to build legal low-power stations around the country. Then in 2003, 2004, represented by Media Access Project, they were the named plaintiff in a lawsuit against the FCC to halt proposed rules that would allow further consolidation. And this had the effect of raising Prometheus's organizational profile. From about 2004 onward, they also campaigned to promote municipal broadband access at state and city levels, and they worked on building some Wi-Fi networks in a hands-on way. Prometheus is a very small organization, and it may seem surprising that they played such an important role, including suing the FCC. But what I want to show is that the identity work and local activities of this small organization are important precisely because of how they were embedded in broader historical and political developments. As for my actual project, I spent 3 years on ethnographic fieldwork from 2003 to 2006, which included participant observation, volunteering in the office in Philadelphia, traveling to Washington and elsewhere in the country for meetings and station building events. So I attended multiple events to build new stations across the US, as well as one in East Africa, outside of Arusha in Tanzania. And I conducted interviews and documentary research on policy, including comments and petitions filed with the FCC and documents produced by advocacy groups. So this slide is just a sort of roadmap of the talk. I do not employ a movement level analysis here. Instead, I'm contending that highly local performances have relevance beyond the confines of the local setting, but I'm looking at local settings. Media activists are an important group to study because of their mediating role. They look both upstream and downstream in terms of imagining the proper uses and interpretations of technologies. And so here I'm drawing from literature on social studies of technology, which is my background, as Daniel mentioned, as well as anthropologists like Chris Kelty, Jeff Jaros, Gail Coleman. So for example, activists may create a novel practice or artifact and promote it to end users while also simultaneously entreating policymakers or other experts to glom onto their interpretation. Edward Woodhouse et al. Define activism as a range of methods used by groups with relatively little institutional power attempting to influence opinion, policy, or practice, end quote. While broadly correct, this definition is vague, and it doesn't shed a lot of light on the actual practices and work of activism. Andreas Glaser states that work is communicative action, which can therefore be analyzed in terms of performance. And in this analysis, I tie the movement level of media activism to practice, ethnographically interrogating what distinguishes this activism as a creative and productive activity. I take actions and utterances to be performances that reveal how activists envision their own roles and the relationships that exist between themselves and others. And as I will discuss, their technical engagement plays a crucial role in purposive political action. According to Julian Orr, what is actually done at work is rarely examined, and many scholarly studies of work do not focus on what is actually done in accomplishing a given job. His admonition becomes all the more important when the job in question is activism, with the range of technical, legal, advocacy, and administrative work that that encompasses. It's really diverse. So what does Prometheus actually do? They would tell you that this is their main work. And this shot, which I had on the title slide, is a radio station and Wi-Fi network building event in Urbana, Illinois in 2005. And so you can see there's a bunch of people standing around and climbing a tower and putting up antennas. So they're building a radio station and a Wi-Fi network for citizens to create their own media. And as I said, that's what they would have you think their work is. So keep that in the background. Scholars including Julian Orr, Kristen Herring, Susan Douglas, Sherry Turkle have discussed work with machines as a site for identity formation. According to Herring, technical identity conveys a closer relationship to technology than is achieved by the average user. Social consequences follow from the associative power of technical identity, end quote. Like radio hams and hackers before them, the Prometheus workers forged strong, affective, even intimate relationships with these technologies. And this identity performance is evidenced in many ways. It includes self-aware interest in geeky topics, including electronics tinkering and technical problems, science fiction, historical knowledge of early radio, and DIY projects. Clothing was also a striking and consistent site of identity display. This is a slide. This fellow on the left here is a Prometheus worker in a 2600 sweatshirt. And that's a Hacker magazine, for those who don't know the reference. And he wore this pretty much all winter. What's going on in this slide more generally is that this is the console of a studio being built in Tennessee. More about clothing. This is from the back of a Prometheus t-shirt. And this diagram is a schematic for a transmitter. And so the workers both wore this and they sold it as sort of, part of their PR. Another form of this technical identity display happened in Louisville, Kentucky in 2005 at a rally for the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is a group of migrant workers with whom Prometheus built a radio station, Radio Conciencia, in 2003. It was a windy day, and the literature that the activists had out was threatening to blow off their table. So they ran to the car to get paperweights. And they grabbed a box of tools, as you can see. That's a soldering iron in the upper left. I noticed that many people who approached the table to pick up a flyer or chat them up offered compliments on the tools. Just comments like, hey, nice paperweights. So not only does this illustrate here a technical identity, it's important to recognize that this is a labor rally, right? So this is actually celebrating a victory by the Immokalee workers against the corporate parent of Taco Bell, for whom they picked tomatoes. And so a lot of these folks are wearing pro-union t-shirts, so I think this is technical identity intersecting with also a sort of craft and labor one. So here it's important to maybe pause and note that technical or geek identity is not necessarily the same as the technical skill. Not everyone in the group of activists, for example, was equally skilled with radio hardware, with computers, or with software. But regardless of technical virtuosity, all of the activists maintain this geek identity. In fact, I think we want to disaggregate the technical expertise from the technical identity, or at least allow that people with relatively less expertise can still take up this geek identity. And this is a somewhat unusual case, perhaps, because here, this geek identity is self-consciously emphasizing participatory skills. And so this would stand in contrast, perhaps, to hackers who might sort of be all about the tops and the virtuosity or hoarding of technical knowledge. Are you sort of good enough to be a member of the club? On the other hand, this radio geek model is really about empowering everyone by sharing knowledge, getting novices to participate, and demystifying their word, not mine, the technology. So they were very serious about this belief that technology not be the exclusive province of experts, and they asserted this through cultivating a geek identity that's, in theory, open to everyone. This unity of activist or participatory values on the one hand and geek identity on the other does not occur without strain, and I'll return to this later. So this stuff all really comes together in what the activists call a barn raising. This is an event where staff and volunteers would come together for a weekend, and they would build a new station and put it on the air, starting on Friday, and it's on the air on Sunday. And so we've got a couple of shots. This is volunteers in Tennessee learning to tune an FM antenna to the frequency that the station will be broadcasting at. And so this barn raising is the most significant symbolic act that the activists undertake, not only for the technical work to build the station, but for the emphasis on participation, on local community, and on interdependence among neighbors. And in fact, they self-consciously borrowed the term barn raising from the Amish. So the activists would routinely say that the barn raising isn't the most efficient way to build a radio station, but it is the best way to build a movement. And so that's what they were self-consciously trying to do. This is another shot of this DIY skill sharing. This is one of the Philadelphia-based activists down here, and he's teaching this young woman to solder, and this is in Arusha, Tanzania. So I'll now turn to a bit of storytelling, another form of identity work. Writing of Xerox technicians, Julian Orr says, the construction of their identity as technicians occurs both in doing the work and in their stories about working with and fixing machines. He quotes Barbara Meyerhoff, who points out that one of the most persistent but elusive ways that people make sense of themselves is to show themselves to themselves by telling themselves stories. More than merely self-recognition, self-definition is made possible by means of such showings, where their content may state not only what people think they are, but what they should have been or may yet be. End quote. So stories of risk, both political and physical, were a powerful way of demonstrating this technical affinity. At the 2005 barn raising in Tennessee, activists and volunteers raised this 100-foot radio tower, antenna tower, and this was a new project for the activists. They would normally put the antenna up on top of an existing structure like a building. This was actually their first time putting up a tower, and the consequences of making a mistake could actually really be catastrophic because they're hoisting it up and it's this tall, spindly needle. We've got all these people standing around holding it steady. This was actually genuinely scary, and it generated a lot of comment at the time. Later in the office, one of the activists, Thomas, said, "Sue the FCC, no problem. But raising that tower, that really scared me." Another volunteer described this as a process with a high capacity for destruction. I'll also add, Prometheus's activities in the US are strictly legal, but they would on occasion smuggle transmitter parts into countries in other parts of the world that could be used in a maybe more legally gray fashion. And when Jasper would narrate his border crossings, he would talk about the risks involved in, going through customs with a suitcase full of electronics. And I want to point out that these stories about risk operate to forge a group identity that's based on these relationships with this technology. There's also a whiff of machismo in these stories, and I'll come back to gender at the end. So now I'll turn, hopefully I've convinced you of the technical identity. I'm going to turn to activist identity before talking about the two together. So the most striking feature of the climate of Prometheus during my fieldwork was this ongoing sense of anxiety, disquietude over their maturing as a nonprofit, and in a weird way grappling with the success that they had attained in their policy field. The lawsuit against the FCC elevated their stature, and for example, before the lawsuit, the New York Times had never given them the time of day, but now they were finding themselves quoted in it. They also had been previously funded through donations to a fiscal sponsor, but during this period they got 501c3 status, started accepting foundation money directly, and saw their annual budget first hit $100,000. So again, giving you the scale of this, it's tiny but getting bigger and more sustainable. The paid staff increased from 3 to 4 during my field work, so again, tiny as a paid cadre, but there were always interns and volunteers on hand, and this was only a fraction of the workforce. This ongoing transformation had important consequences. One was boundary work on the part of the Prometheus workers to differentiate themselves as an activist group from mainstream advocacy groups, even those who showed many of their goals. So this would be an example of an artifact, building coalitions with, say, other big advocacy groups in Washington. So it's about, telling the FCC about cities. But so they're, coalition building, but at the same time they're trying to maintain this boundary all the time. And I would speculate that this was a recent development. When I started my time with the group, they were poised on this sort of boundary between, legitimacy and, on the other hand, retaining something of an outsider stance. I think when they were younger, they were probably more concerned about being received as legitimate spokespeople in legislative arenas in the first place. A number of illuminating moments occurred when I accompanied them to Washington, D.C. At the second ever meeting of Prometheus's board, they discussed challenges they faced. One organizer, Ellen, contrasted their work to the other groups that did media reform, because she said, quote, unlike Free Press, which is of course an advocacy group founded by Bob McChesney and John Nichols, she says, unlike Free Press, we don't carpetbag organize. We have to pay attention to the grassroots, end quote. This became particularly important as Prometheus took on complex spectrum management issues that actually didn't command a lot of grassroots attention. One of them captured their dilemma by saying, no one goes around with signs that say, free the spectrum. Be the closest. So they were uneasy that this new policy focus would pollute what they considered their identity as Washington outsiders to be. At the same meeting, they expressed concern that since they had gained legitimacy from their lawsuit, they were devoting more resources to grant writing and chasing funding, and that their technical services were suffering. Also on that trip, Prometheus held a meeting in offices of the nonprofit advocacy group Common Cause to teach members of the public to urge Congress to support a bill to expand LPFM, which finally happened in 2010 after the close of my fieldwork. Prometheus did not formally participate in lobbying, but they had allies who came to the meeting to give tips to the people who were there. Prometheus displayed ambivalence. Ellen told attendees, we hate that we have to get you up and do this to undo the bad work of the National Association of Broadcasters, who limited the number of stations. We'd rather concentrate on building stations, but we have to do this first. At the same time, Prometheus actually did go on the legislative visits with the citizens, and so they were kind of belying expertise that they had. But Ellen, again, at another point in this meeting, described Washington as, quote, a crazy place full of magical buildings and towers that we don't understand all that well, so they're distancing themselves. Nothing can illustrate this more than when the FCC hosted a half-day forum on Low-Power FM on February 8th, 2005. And this is the FCC welcoming the public, the clip art of the public, into the commission. And then after it's over, this is folks milling around. And I don't know if this is very clear, but this is one of the radio activists in the center. And on the right here is Chairman Michael Powell. So again, rubbing elbows inside the commission. This was actually largely a symbolic gesture. It had already been made clear that the FCC wasn't going to announce any major policy changes, but they were formally letting people in, and people were making their presence known. I would like to illustrate, though, that there's a big difference in tone between this event and one held by the activists, including some of the Prometheus folks, in 1998. So I have to apologize for the resolution of this slide, but this is the same fellow who's, wearing a button-down shirt talking to Michael Powell. 7 years earlier, he's outside, this says Federal Communications Commission, take my word for it. He's outside the commission. This is obviously looks like pretty traditional street theater. What you can't actually tell is that they're also broadcasting the protest illegally from one of those lunchbox transmitters into the commission. So it's pretty clear that it's bittersweet for them in 2005 to be making their point, legally, quietly, and on terms entirely set by the FCC. Back home at the office in Philadelphia, there was also palpable ambivalence about their changing status as an organization. They would routinely tease each other for using words like constituents and deliverables. They would use them, but then they would say, oh my God, I can't believe I just said deliverables. Somebody shoot me. So they were feeling like they drew strength and a unique identity from the fact that they were, again, in their minds, in touch with the grassroots and not a mainstream nonprofit. Returning to clothing, Ellen perfectly expressed attention over this boundary when she told everyone that she'd bought a pair of, quote, Congress pants in a thrift store. And this is pants that she felt like she could wear to be part of the uniform of lobbyists, regulators, and Washington insiders. She needed to have these clothes. She was going into these spaces, but she made it really clear that they were a costume and one that she was very proud to have obtained secondhand, which no true insider would do. So beyond these sort of flip teasing remarks, organizational commitments also shone through in some situations like hiring. During a job search, Jasper and Ellen had a dispute over the draft of the description. His draft said, quote, must not be afraid of mice. Our office sometimes has a lot of them, end quote. Ellen was dismayed by this and said, how can you expect anyone to take us seriously if we don't take ourselves seriously? They put it out to the interns and the volunteers. They thought it was funny, not inaccurate, and okay to leave in, but she struck out that language. I want to point out, though, that nobody raised any objection to the statement that also went out in the ad, quote, dress is casual, though on occasion you may need to bathe and pull on something that has no holes in it. And to illustrate, this is a couple of the organizers in the foreground, and this is everyday dress, not just because they're outside. Everyday dress when they're not at least in Washington. After the interviews, the staff had narrowed down the pool. They agreed that 2 applicants, Brian and a woman named Robin, were strong with attributes that complemented each other. The decision was made to offer the job as 2 half-time positions to each of them. This may not sound so unusual until one considers that Robin had told them that she didn't believe in any government regulation of the airwaves, and that if she took the job, she wouldn't speak to the FCC. It may be telling that she found a different job and turned them down. They hired Brian full-time. But it's striking that perhaps because her beliefs represented some idealized stance of their own, Prometheus was actually willing to reconfigure the description in order to hire her, even though it clearly would have been a lot more trouble. So in thinking about this, I draw on work by anthropologist Dominic Boyer, who discusses the concept of critical agency. For Boyer, critical agency implies the existence of a belief in a critical space within or outside of normal social relations from which critical knowledge of these relations can be articulated. He applies this to journalists and to intellectuals, but the concept, I think, is an important one for activism as well. Activists believe that they have critical agency and may even need to believe that they have critical agency as they articulate positions of dissent or alterity. And here, identity work is occurring constantly around this critical stance. The activist discomfort over becoming a mainstream nonprofit is a subset of a more general performance of criticism of mainstream values. Nonprofits were viewed by these actors as suspicious, at least sometimes, for being too close to establishment values, for not being radicalized enough, and for their potential to change activists into insiders who have lost sight of their criticality. So they're making a critique of a mainstream middle-class identity. They often lived in communal homes. As I said, they joked about bathing habits, didn't dress in a professional manner, and are wearing these unkempt beards, which is specific to the masculine gender mainly. Mainly. Can talk about that. So these 2 defining identities here. Geek and activist occur together, sometimes complementing each other and sometimes coming into conflict. Consider how the activist commitment circumscribes the technical one in this case. These are technical experts who are not professional, they're not white collar, and they're very anti-technocratic. These experts had to remind each other to be on time for congressional meetings, ribbing each other and saying, you know, some people actually go to their jobs at 9 in the morning. They also resisted stable occupational titles. A woman who had volunteered for Prometheus for years stepped up her involvement and asked what titles we should use. Jasper replied, at Prometheus, everyone gets to make up their own title. It's an abbreviation. How about spectral director, chief of rainbows, wave associate? You can't have director of electromagnetism because that's mine, end quote. So these titles are obviously, you know, flippant and playful, but also notably that they are making reference to technical and material properties of spectrum. They're very geeky as well. So, as I hope it's apparent, this assertion and maintenance of technical identity in these circumstances was a way of managing anxiety about the attenuation of activist identity in the face of a more professionalized, more expert work environment. Their emphasis on a hands-on technical sensibility was very much a way of performing we're not them position vis-a-vis the more professional insiders and experts whom they encounter in their work and against whom they wish to define themselves. Ironically, geek identity, even though it's intended to bolster a sense of unity amongst activists, certainly had its own exclusiveness. Geeks might pride themselves on lacking the slick interpersonal style of lobbyists and political insiders. But more to the point, they pride themselves on what lobbyists and political insiders ostensibly lack, the desire and ability to get their hands dirty. Lobbyists can't build radio stations. And in Washington, I once witnessed a symbolic display where they presented their lawyer with a handmade radio from South Africa, which was very much a sort of, you know, you're one of us now gesture. The difference was being overcome. So this slide, comic relief, but it also illustrates some of the contradictions I'm trying to draw out. This is crucially from late 2007. So it's 2 years after the LPFM forum at the FCC. In spite of maturing further as a nonprofit, the activists are still willing to go do street theater outside the regulating body's offices. As you can see, they're wearing these FCC cheerleader outfits. Once again, somebody picked these up at a thrift store. And they're boisterously rallying in front of the commission to protest media consolidation. I will not cheer for you, but I'll read this one. Rules are for losers, rules are for suckers. We don't need no media rules. Merge, merge, merge. And so I want to point out that in spite of their oppositional politics and sympathy towards pirates, they're actually cheering and chiding the commission for regulating too little. And this is a really stark contrast to some other strains of techno-libertarian media activism. For example, some of the open source software communities. This is not code is law, this is law, and they're engaging with, you know, formal politics here. Another role of geek and activist identities in this case is to give actors resources that enable them to assign meaningful coherence to the diverse range of tasks that they encounter. These include not only the symbolic front stage moments like the barn raisings and entering the halls of power in Washington, but fundamental backstage activities, paperwork, staff meetings, maintaining databases, sending out mailings, and other forms of routine and tedious work that I'm leaving out here in the interest of time, but did in fact constitute a huge amount of their practice. I want to be very clear, I'm not saying that these distinctions are, quote, real. It's more that they are doing really important work in the minds of this group as it sought to mature, to refine its mission, and yet to continue to work in a way perceived to be in line with radical activist ideals. I also want to point out that anxiety over being mainstreamed is not novel for an activist group, but the strategy that they picked to manage these tensions seems uniquely adapted to the history and commitments of a crew of radio geeks. Other groups not engaged in a technical form of activism would have to find a different strategy to manage this activist identity in the face of organizational change. Having, I hope, established the salience of technical identities that operated within the group, I want to move on to some different points about the consequences for the cultivation of technical identity as an activist strategy to increase political participation. As I've said, this geek identity was important. It lent activists coherence to their work, and it served as a resource to draw boundaries between themselves and so-called Washington insiders. But this choice to exalt technical identity as a means to support egalitarian practices had unintended fallout for the activists. The radio activists elevated the technical. This was a dynamic they promoted over and over, workshops, barn raisings, and not only internally to their own group, but facing outwards. They placed significant emphasis on teaching technical skills, and this pedagogy was a huge part of their organizing practice. They presented geek identification as universally accessible and as a means to political empowerment. But in practice, they wound up confronting historical patterns of inclusion and exclusion pertaining to race and gender that had already crystallized around the electronics practices they promoted. For example, at barn raisings, while the stated goal was no one's allowed to do anything they already know how to do, this was incredibly difficult to pull off in practice, even though their awareness about these sort of differences in expertise was high. With little exception, the most skilled people at barn raisings were always engineers. So returning to this tuning of the antenna slide, these are novices, holding it, putting their hands on it, learning how to, use the tech, but outside the frame, who's telling them how to do it is engineers. In an interview, one activist described the challenge he faced in trying to make sure that barn raisings were attended by techies who shared Prometheus's radical vision, which he thought was at odds with a more traditional engineering culture of exclusion. He said, quote, "A lot of the old school dude engineers, they don't always get it. They can be standoffish, exclusive, have problems with approachability. Like Jim, who's a prime example of a not approachable engineer. He's a fucking grump, and if he weren't such a genius, I don't think I would want him there. But it's tough, because we have to balance people who can get shit done and possess the greatest expertise with people who can teach. And ultimately, there are a couple of things that are beyond me technically, and there are a couple of other more expert people I need to rely on. It's a struggle to find people who can do everything. I try really hard to get people of color and women engineers there, but I don't know that many. There just aren't that many. Look at me, I'm a white guy. I'm one of millions of white dudes who went to engineering school. I just happen to have a more lefty attitude than most of them," unquote. And a technically skilled volunteer who's a woman shared her impressions as well. She said, "I've been sensitive to Prometheus's sensitivity. They make no bones about saying it's a dude fest, we need more women. But I feel an odd responsibility. I definitely feel like I'm extra visible and I should be extra visible. I understand what I have to contribute. Chicks with Ethernet cables, there's a certain inherent value in that, even just seeing that, especially for people who aren't used to seeing it," end quote. For this volunteer, her technical skills made her feel extra visible, like she was a part of Prometheus's display of their activist vision. She clearly had a feminine identity coupled with this technical chops. She also felt that at least among the media activists themselves, the unequal distribution of skills was not primarily due to sexism or exclusionary behavior on the part of the men, but due to a shortage of women willing to learn and display technical skill. She said, "The framework is there. It's ready for women like me to jump in. This community is ready for women with good tech skills, and they're who I most get along with. Unfortunately, I keep finding kick-ass men," end quote. So like the other activists, she felt that part of the problem here was a shortage of women who had the range of confidence and comfort with technology. She felt that the feminist men's attempts to be inclusive towards women were genuine and mostly adequate. I want to point out, though, that as a woman who was not intimidated by tech and already had a high degree of skill, she might feel different from neophytes, men and women, who were potentially more derailed by competitive, standoffish, or masculine displays as they tried to engage with technology as novices. And I discussed that elsewhere, so I'll skip it here. So now turning from gender to another example. The activists had some arguable success in terms of gender inclusion, but they had even greater difficulty in terms of race and class. Since their introduction in 2000, the LPFM licenses were nearly impossible to obtain in cities. Partly due to a desire not to exclude these urban areas, Prometheus became interested in the relevance of community Wi-Fi networks to their organizing mission. And so in 2005-2006, they consulted on a project with a Chicago nonprofit called Neighbors for Access to Technology, NAT, who had built a small Wi-Fi network consisting of a few nodes, reaching a community center and a few homes. NAT hoped to build this up into a larger network in an economically disadvantaged, largely African-American neighborhood, Maple Park, and for this they were interested in collaborating with Prometheus, especially hoping to draw on their expertise leading hands-on workshops, and maybe even hold a Wi-Fi barn raising. And this is one of those kinds of DIY artifacts, which is called a cantenna. As you can see, this is a directional Wi-Fi antenna made out of a coffee can. So after arriving in Chicago for meetings, though, Prometheus activists felt uneasy. They were concerned that some of the neighborhood residents' interest in this community Wi-Fi stopped short of their own agenda, which included social change through community media and not only internet connectivity. The neighborhood residents were interested in improving their communication infrastructure. One person said, "This is a chance not to just keep up with society, but to advance beyond it. People want to use this to start businesses and for education." However, others had a legitimate concern that this investment in improving the neighborhood might not solely be in the interest of current residents. A historically poor neighborhood in a desirable location with a well-developed communications infrastructure might be a target for gentrification. Historian Rayvon Fouché also notes that there are historical reasons why African Americans may in some cases have an adversarial relationship to technology, particularly that introduced by whites. And so keep in mind that NAT was not based in Maple Park, the neighborhood, and Prometheus was not even from Chicago. So while the proposed network was welcome, Prometheus's model of bringing in volunteers and holding these workshops to teach political participation through demystifying tech was very hard to import into this site. An NAT staff member picked up on this and said, quote, "There will never be a time when it will be okay for hundreds of people who don't live in Maple Park to come volunteer there," end quote. This made Maple Park a troublesome site to plan a Wi-Fi barn raising, and activists decided Maple Park wasn't the place that was most appropriate to showcase their burgeoning interest in Wi-Fi. Part of why Maple Park put the Prometheans in a bind was that they did not wish to project an image as white paternalists, even though their organization and volunteer base was largely composed of an educated white segment of the population. The activists were always careful to frame their activities as self-consciously anti-racist work, promoting cultural exchange, as opposed to a group of mostly white activists providing a commodity or a service to a less privileged other. In an interview, one organizer said, quote, "Privilege allows us to not realize that media is a life and death issue for other people. As a white activist group, we're in solidarity. They can use community media to do it themselves," end quote. Even so, their strategy of promoting a form of technical engagement that was historically associated with elite white male practitioners may have actually heightened the perception of difference between some community groups and their organization. And here I'll also note that even as some media activism is explicitly intended as a means to an end in the struggle against inequality, this activism is certainly not immune to problems faced by other social movements which struggle with inclusion, representation, and differences in privilege and positionality between members of the movement. So it's not a unique phenomenon, but it's being exacerbated by tech in this case. Ron Eglish's work on geeks, nerds, race, and gender is instructive here. For Eglish, the whiteness and masculinity embedded in geek identity may restrict non-whites or women from embracing technological affinity. Members of these other categories may improvise or innovate different strategies for retaining technocultural access or identification. In the case of these media activists, technological affinity, tenets of geek and expertise, these tenets of geek identity, were intended to be universally accessible. But in fact, a main lesson of barn raisings and other workshops, a main lesson that they hope to impart in barn raisings and other workshops is that this technological affinity was attainable even without the expertise. You could have the political awakening, demystify the tech, even if you didn't actually walk away knowing how to build a radio station all by yourself. So there's a clear intent for this technological engagement to transcend other social identities people construct and experience, like race and gender. Yet, their hopes were not always achieved. It remained consistently challenging to cultivate this technological affinity across historically and culturally constructed boundaries of gender and race. Eglish suggests that the technical identity itself may contribute to the activist lack of headway in terms of inclusion of non-whites. The association of affective technical engagement with white masculinity is quite entrenched. So in concluding, there's sort of an irony here. What I hope I've shown is that the technical practice was of great symbolic importance for the activists as they charted their organization's path, and it bolstered them as they considered the growth of their organization and their relationship with other groups in the terrain of media democracy. But at the same time, the established historical associations between geekery and white masculinity wound up in some ways making the activist project harder for them. It undercut their deeply egalitarian goals. In sum, using technical practice as a platform to advance emancipatory goals was a significant and novel, but ultimately problematic strategy for media activism. And so I think we should be wary of romanticizing DIY and instead be always thinking about the politics of technical participation. That's all. Thank you for your time.
Questions for Christina? After she takes.
Well, I can add something. Yeah, I appreciate your presentation. Very, very interesting. But I wonder your last point, that because it is associated with white masculinity, this reminds me of Paul Willis, the ethnography. Paul Willis, the ethnography of Paul Willis, that it was the association with white middle class masculinity. But is this as hard for example, Latino activists to actually involve people from the community?
To actually involve people
from the community. So if, rather than being this group, it would have been a Latino-led group, and even men and women, it's very, very hard. So I'm kind of questioning if it is the point of the identity, especially the gender and race class identity.
Well, I'm not actually, thank you for this comment. I'm not actually sure these are not related, or not, that what you're saying isn't sort of bolstering, because it's actually not, I'm not only talking about the identity of the people who are overwhelmingly, try as they might, the people who show up with the best tech skills are often white men who have been trained as engineers. It's not just the identity of the people, it's also the practices. So
yeah, no, I understand.
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying. But even in other kinds of practices, in other kinds of media practices, it's very difficult. So I'm just trying to move from the identity to other reasons, like people are working all the time.
Sure.
So
yeah.
many other kinds of reasons, material reasons.
Sure. No, I think that I would never say that this occurs in isolation from like structural factors, and I talk more about that. It's just that what I'm,
yeah, no, I see your point.
pieces,
I see your point.
But no, that's completely taken. And I think one of the things here is that the identity work is intended to actually help address some of the structural problems, but it's pretty challenging, right? That's what I would say. But really good point. Thanks. Yeah. I feel like you guys are pulling me further and further towards you.
Oh, that's
dark
good.
back there.
We like you down here, so we can see it.
Yeah.
You didn't say much about the content or the actually what was broadcast on the fire radio station. So
That's a wonderful question. So LPFM spans the entire gamut and the entire political spectrum, and I talk about that elsewhere. Part of what is an interesting feature of this is, you guys remember like the flap over Janet Jackson's, reveal? So that incident caused a flood of comments at the FCC opposing media consolidation, and it was people all over the political spectrum. So it's like consumer advocacy groups, left-wing activists, free press, but it was also like the NRA and sort of right-wing already mobilized constituencies, because some people thought consolidation was bad for democracy and other people thought consolidation was bad for like indecency. So like if the lowest common denominator in one company owns everything, they have no incentive not to show, flash press 24 hours a day because people want that. So media consolidation has strange bedfellows politically, and LPFM does as well. I'm focusing, of course, on a radical left group, but they had to ally to get this legislation passed with evangelical churches, because that was actually also a huge pre-existing, community group base that wanted these stations, right? And actually the first round of licenses, probably half of them went to religious broadcasters, which you don't see at all here, of course. And so I think something that I talk about that runs throughout this is the tension of, is it the medium or is it the message? And in promoting, the medium, they completely leave, the activists completely leave unacknowledged the potential for regressive outcomes. It's sort of just like better democracy, everybody gets to speak. And on the one hand, that's compelling, but like in the 1920s, localism wasn't valued, that was seen as provincialism, and the Klan had radio stations. You don't hear about that from these folks. Great question. But yeah, so LPFM spanned the gamut. Who they actually supported with farm raisings, though, had to be people with like very progressive or left ideals. They weren't going to expend their resources. But really good question.
Can I make a footnote? Can I make a footnote?
Sure.
A plug of what you just said. One of our graduates, a PhD student, Andy Open, actually wrote his dissertation.
I didn't know he was out of here. Yeah, of course I know that book. Yeah, great.
Uh-huh.
I didn't realize that. Yeah, he's in Florida now.
Yeah. He's in Florida, Tallahassee.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I really enjoyed your talk. There's a lot of great detail in there, and really took a lot away from your focus on identity work as a way to problematize, some of the coalitional problems with other types of activism. And I really appreciated your warning about romanticizing DIY at the end. And I think I just, as a prompt rather than a question, was wondering if you could speak about any other types of connections to media activism. Like, so the Chicago example seemed to be more about translating community activism, and so I'm thinking about media justice movements or Magnet or even environmental racism or other types of media materiality activism that there might be some openings in. And then also I was wondering too about what I've started to call analog culture as a way that that seems like there would be some affinities to, but also some hostilities to in terms of other forms of craft labor or craft-based identity in a digital world. Just two openings.
Well, so the first one, tell me a little more about what you're thinking with the analog culture and actually that's the second one. Tell me about the first one. Sorry.
I'm just wondering if there's any because the Prometheus seems so desirous of, even committed to, expanding or connecting to other aspects of media reform, for example. And so I was just wondering if given their ambivalence about targeting the FCC, if there are other types of grassroots media activism that have where they've made connections or see openings like that, or where you found the identity conflicts playing out.
Yeah, so media, I'm not the person who's first made this point, but media reform and media democracy is a particularly interesting and heterogeneous movement because, the narrative since at least the 90s is people were working on other kinds of activism, like AIDS activism or housing or whatever kinds of XYZ social justice causes, and then realized the problem was the media, and that's why their activism couldn't progress, is that they didn't have access to institutions or self-representation or whatever. And so many people have looked at the media democracy movement, if you can even call it that, as kind of an umbrella meta movement that has all these different constituents in it. And that is also kind of interesting, and people have said makes it different from kind of identity-based social movements, because it's always self-consciously this sort of meta thing. And that's also like their narratives that they were doing other kinds of activism and then realized everybody with radio station that would support all activism. There was certainly a lot of alliances being built and horse trading and stuff going on with different campaigns and different groups, and there was even something called the Media and Democracy Coalition, which I think was basically funders saying we want the right hand and the left hand to be, you know, working together, and so trying to make different kinds of groups focused on different kinds of issues come together and, you know, talk about, you know, we're working on this campaign, what are you doing, and, you know, be more efficient. And they hated that. I mean, they hated it. They said nasty things about it. And actually, but I don't have any data about that because I was banned from one of these meetings. It was the only time I was ever not allowed in. And I think, again, it was politics. It was like Prometheus, someone told them, like, you can't bring your person who's going to take notes on our infighting.
Right.
Yeah. And then there's also other sites like the Allied Media Projects, which are more radical and more class and, you know, race-oriented, and
Yeah.
grew out of, I believe, a zine conference, right? And have now moved to Detroit. I've only been to that once. I'd like to go again. But yeah, I sort of wound up listening at all these other sites, but without, you know, this was the primary one, so I don't know if I have a good answer.
Yeah, no, that helps give a
Yeah.
really fit.
Yeah.
Thanks.
As for your other point about sort of craft, super fascinating, and also how it intersects with gender is really interesting, and probably other things. And here I draw on Daniel's advisor, Fred Turner's work about appropriate technology being, you know, these folks are really strongly inheriting a lot of those values, but appropriate technology, and Turner writes, it sort of reproduced a suburban fantasy on the commune. And so some of the things that I document are people who are really into, you know, knitting and kombucha and, you know, whatever kinds of.
Are they invested in cashing in on the, you know, the retro cachet of potential of radio as opposed to digital media activism today? You know, thinking about knitting or records and tapes and other types of revivals.
They haven't been that interested in that. They're a little more, if you'll forgive me, there's a little more kind of new left expediency and sort of stridency, and they're, I think, sometimes more ambivalent about the kind of lifestyle aspects.
Right.
On the other hand, they're over and over embodying these lifestyle aspects.
Right.
But I also had some data about someone saying this sort of neo-traditional urban analog culture stuff was really hard for her because she was interested in knitting and the sort of feminine craft practices, but she also wanted to do electronics, and she felt like some of these people really wanted to kind of reinscribe neo-traditional gender roles. So that's, I think, another point of, like, it doesn't map as well onto the more sort of feminist project sometimes. Although there's a lot you can say about feminism and post-feminism and whatnot. That's
Yeah.
Maybe one more quick question before we break.
Sure.
Joey.
So I keep thinking about, from what you're talking about, group formation and identity politics, and I specifically can't stop thinking about the Congress pants. And
good to hear.
yeah. I mean, it's been running through my head, and as you said at the beginning, you were using pseudonyms for people. And I, as you said, Congress pants, and as you were saying the things that people were saying, the pseudonyms you used were gendered names, and so I kept trying to think, the statements that these people were giving, could someone else have that? Would you have given a name that was gendered a particular way? Would you have switched those around ever, right?
That's a fair question. Sorry, go on, but finish, please.
Well, I think you know exactly where I'm going with it, and so specific to the Congress pants, that was, you know, I don't think that a man who is a former engineer who is choosing to look, you know, I wrote down working class, is making those choices. Like, I don't see those comments switching with regards to gender, class, or race for anybody else who has a position that they're, I mean, it takes a certain amount of comfort, I guess.
Meaning?
To
Like
not care about
Right.
Congress pants.
Yes, and engineers would be a classic group
Right.
who, I mean, walk into a physics lab or something. You know, people have written about the, you know, habitus of science, and it's, far too, head in the clouds and theoretical to be concerned with, presentation of self or not having, food down your throat or something.
Right.
On the other hand, of course, that kind of habitus is exclusively available to people with a lot of kinds of privilege in the culture.
Exactly.
And so I think that you're absolutely right to sort of bring that up. And, I mean, methodologically, anonymity is very complicated, as is naming people. And you're right, I thought even at certain points about like switching, various kinds of identities, but I can't because I can't do the analysis that I want to. And also, I'll be honest with you guys, like this is the slide that I had up for the whole discussion of the episode in Chicago. And I kind of go back and forth. Sometimes I show pictures and I always feel like I'm really deeply essentializing people, and other times I don't. And so I kind of had this up because I didn't really want to get into being so reductionist about, identity categories and demographic categories, but it's a vexing and interesting question, so thank you for bringing it up.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Yes.